Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast aimed at intermediate to advanced level English learners. Over the last year and a half, the way people live, work, socialise, and much more has completely changed. While we are beginning to return to normal in some ways, it is also possible that we will never return to the way things were before the pandemic. So, in this episode, let's look at which country is currently the most normal in the world. But first, why not follow the Thinking in English Instagram page, Thinking in English podcast, or the link is in the description. And you definitely should look at our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for all of the transcripts and bonus content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on our blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Accustomed. Familiar with something. For example, she quickly became accustomed to his strange sleeping pattern. To invest in. To put money, effort, or time, etc., into something in order to improve it or to get an advantage. For example, my favorite restaurant invested in iPads to make ordering easier. Viable. If something is viable, it is able to work as intended or able to succeed. As in, with government restrictions, it is no longer viable to hold our event. Extent. Another word for extent is amount. For example, we don't know the extent of his injuries. Normalcy is the state of being normal, and it is also known as normality. For example, now the war is over, perhaps our region will return to normalcy. Indicator. An indicator is something that shows what a situation is like. For example, increasing sales is an indicator that the food industry is recovering. Congested. If roads are congested, it means there is too much traffic and movement is difficult. For instance, the roads are always congested on national holidays. Conversely, in an opposite way. For example, children from rich areas are encouraged to go to university. Conversely, children from poor areas don't have as many opportunities. Controversy. A lot of disagreement or arguments about something, usually because it affects or is important to many people. For example, there is a lot of controversy surrounding the Tokyo Olympics. At first, the title of this episode might seem like a strange idea. How can somewhere be the most normal? And what even is a normal country? What does normal mean here? Often Europeans and Westerners, like myself, I guess, tend to think that our culture and our country is ordinary, and everywhere else, especially places in the Middle East or Africa or Asia, they are different and maybe strange. I don't think this at all. And actually, I don't think there is such a thing as a normal country. unless we are talking about questions in, I guess, social sciences and political science, especially if, is a country really a country? So, what do I mean? What do I mean by normal in this title? Why have I titled this episode, "What is the most normal country in the world?" Well, COVID-19 has changed every country, territory, continent, and region. The way we live our lives, travel, work, socialize, buy things, and much more is in many cases fundamentally different to before the pandemic. While some people have started to talk about the new normal, others are still hoping that the world will return to the way it used to be. Personally, I think that it will be difficult to return to our pre-pandemic lives. Societies and the people who live in our societies have started to get used to or become accustomed to new ways of doing things. For example, many businesses have adjusted their practices and invested in new technology and equipment to stay financially viable during lockdowns and quarantines. In my hometown, restaurants and pubs began offering delivery services, using new safety materials, and creating ordering apps so you don't need to order drinks or food at the bar. And for companies and businesses that couldn't change, many of these have unfortunately had to close permanently. I think that many of these new ways of doing things, especially the new way of working from home for many people, I think that this might stay for a while. However, you might think differently to me, and that's okay. In fact, if you are more optimistic than I am, I actually hope you're correct. I wish the world would return to the way it used to be. It would be easier to socialize, to travel, work. All the time, I see and I hear people talking about what they are going to do after COVID. In fact, earlier today, I was talking with a journalist and a media professor, and he said he hoped that we could meet in person after this COVID issue is finished. And I think everyone has at least once asked themselves the question, when is the world going to be normal again? As I mentioned, probably every country in the world is different now compared to before the pandemic. However, which country or place is the closest to normal? Here, by normal, I mean the way life was before January 2020. By looking at how things have changed and to what extent things have changed, maybe we could see where life is the most normal. And we could also see where life has changed the most. Fortunately for us, The Economist magazine has already done most of the hard work. They have created the Global Normalcy Index, which tries to answer the question, is the world returning to pre-pandemic life? If you're interested in checking out the original article that I'm, basing this episode off, there's a link in the blog. But I'm going to summarize it in slightly easier to understand English, I hope, anyway. So, while some areas of life are returning to the way they used to be, perhaps other things and other issues will take a longer time to normalize. Or perhaps they are now permanently changed. The Normalcy Index looks at the way behavior has changed due to the pandemic. The Economist magazine selected 50 of the world's largest economies, together making up about 90% of global GDP and about 76%, or 3/4 of the world's population. Pre-pandemic behavior in the Normalcy Index is given a base score of 100. And the behavior now is given either a lower score or a higher score. If there is a lower score, it means there is less of that behavior. Or if there is a higher score, it means there is more of that behavior. So the further away from 100, the less normal, the more different life has become. To do this, they used 8 different indicators and compared the differences for each of these indicators between now and the pre-pandemic. For instance, they looked at how many people are using public transport in major cities, how congested the traffic is, the number of domestic and international flights. In addition, The Economist wanted to check how people's social lives and free time has altered. So they examined how much time people spend away from their houses, how many people are going to the cinema, and how many people are attending sporting events. And finally, they also checked how busy shops are and how many people are currently working in offices, or working at home, I guess, is the opposite. These 8 factors, when combined, can help us begin to understand how life has changed over the last year. And by ranking each country or each area, we can maybe understand which places have remained the most normal. Now, normal doesn't mean good, right? You could stay normal. Life now could be the same as it was 2 years ago. But your life 2 years ago might have been bad. There might have been a lot of problems in your country. So normal here does not mean good, right? It's just continuing on from before the pandemic. So what are their findings? What are the results of the Global Normalcy Index? In March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic for most of the world, the levels of normalcy in many countries dropped significantly, massively, really. Countries imposed restrictions, lockdowns, and quarantines on their people. Most recreational places were closed, and people were forced to work from home, schools were shut, and almost all travel was limited or stopped. On the Economist's index, the global average score was 35, compared to the normal score of 100, which is a really big drop in levels. Over the past 18 months, the global average has steadily improved and is now about 70 points. So, although our countries are more normal than at the beginning of the pandemic, we still have a long way to go before we have returned to our pre-pandemic lives. What this suggests is that certain indicators and certain issues are, returning to normal. Perhaps there is more traffic on the roads or more people taking public transport. But at the same time, certain other issues have not recovered. Especially, I think, the recreation and entertainment industries. Despite this, just looking at the global average hides the reality of the situation around the world. Every country is not the same. On the contrary, there is significant variations between countries and also between the 8 indicators. According to The Economist, currently none of the 50 countries they tracked have returned to normalcy. However, in February 2021, China did briefly reach pre-pandemic levels of behavior due to more and significant movies being released and people traveling around the country to celebrate Lunar New Year. At the moment, Hong Kong, which has had quite an effective response to COVID-19, is at the top of the global normalcy rankings, meaning that life there is the closest to before the pandemic. Other countries, which are relatively normal compared to before the pandemic, are Egypt, Nigeria, and Pakistan. On the other hand, Malaysia, which is currently suffering from a serious wave of infections, is currently at the bottom of the rankings. Another interesting way to look at the Global Normalcy Index is to see which countries have changed the most over the past few weeks. For example, Turkey, Chile, and Egypt are quickly moving closer to normalcy as they remove restrictions and people begin to return to their old habits. Conversely, South Africa, the Czech Republic, and Indonesia are moving away from normalcy. South Africa, for example, is suffering another wave of COVID infections and, at the same time, is experiencing nationwide protests. Next, I think it's useful to look at each of the different indicators used by The Economist to test how normal a country is. Transport and travel has recovered relatively well over the last year and is getting closer to normal levels. Across the globe, more people are using buses and trains, while the roads around cities and in cities are getting busier. However, the exception is flights, and especially international flights. With border restrictions still in place for most places, traveling internationally is incredibly difficult. At the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, behavior connected to recreation and entertainment was practically zero. Due to lockdowns, which in some cases were very strictly enforced, people spent most of their time at home, while most entertainment facilities were closed. While this is slowly changing, The Economist data suggests that recovery has been slow in cinemas and movie theatres. People's behavior seems to have changed, and this could cause the movie industry to also change forever. For example, there has been controversy recently, as major film companies are now releasing new movies online and on streaming platforms, instead of in the movie theatre. Black Widow, the latest Marvel movie, was released on both Disney Plus and in movie theatres at the same time, which resulted in quite low attendances at cinemas across the world. With people more used to watching things online, and more people using the likes of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus, perhaps our entertainment industries, our movie industry, will never return to normal. And finally, the way we work and the way we shop has changed dramatically. And I think perhaps it will never return to how it used to be. More companies and employees are keen to keep flexible working arrangements and to use remote work options like Zoom. Many employees don't want to commute to work, especially if their commuting time was long and their work hours were also long. Working at home can be a lot easier. And major companies have realized that renting expensive offices in the center of cities is not always necessary. Employees can work well from home. People are also buying more products online. While there is some debate whether we will keep shopping online, what do you think? Do you think it will stay the same? I'm not sure. So here is today's final thought. Overall, according to The Economist, Hong Kong is the most normal territory in the world. And by normal, I mean that life there is the closest to pre-pandemic behavior. People in Hong Kong's lives now are relatively similar, relatively normal, compared to what they used to be. However, for almost every country in the world, our behavior still has a long way to go before we return to normalcy. While things like transport and travel are slowly returning to pre-pandemic levels, the way we work, shop, and spend our free time may have changed forever. How about your country? How close is it to normal now? How much has your life changed due to the pandemic? Do you think the world will ever return to normalcy? Or should we accept and get used to the new normal. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Thinking in English. Please share with your friends, check out our social media links in the description, and send us a message. We really appreciate all of your feedback. And if you have any ideas for topics or future podcast guests or any other learning format, please let us know. And please leave me a rating. We're now on Instagram. I'm sure you've already seen it, but go there, check it out. Lots of good content about vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. And Instagram is a great way to contact me. It's Thinking in English Podcast on Instagram, or the link is in the description. Also, all of the transcripts of the podcast are now available on the Thinking in English blog. Vocabulary list, comprehension questions, and all of the articles are there for you to read. That link is also in the description, so please check it out too. Thank you, and see you next time.